Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Lynnwood Bartley, and will be your host for today's show. And let me introduce our regulars, and then the pleasure of introducing Leigh Ford, who has returned from where?
Hiatus.
Hiatus, okay. Don Cooney, who's the city commissioner and at the School of Social Work at Western, and Ron Kramer on my right, your left, who is the director of the Criminal Justice Program at Western and the Sociology Department. Leigh, welcome back.
Thank you.
It's a delight to have you.
Thank you.
And it's been a while since I've been away from the department. You have become a school.
Yes, we have.
Since that
Yes,
time, so, and you are the director of the School of Communication.
I am. Yeah.
A very busy person.
Yes.
The school is out. You have a chance to come back, and we are, as I said, delighted that you have. We have been concerned about the fiscal cliff, which is, of course, a exaggerated metaphor. And I know you also have been concerned about it. So if you would be willing to help us plunge into the subject.
Plunge over?
Plunge over, yeah.
Sure.
Help save us from going over the cliff.
Sure. Well, let me first say it's really great to be back with my pals. I've missed having these conversations and having the opportunity to contribute to what I hope and really believe has always been a rational discussion of what are often very emotional issues and issues that are often talked about in a non-rational, irrational way. And I think the physical cliff is probably an example of such an irrational discussion. I think we need to start by understanding that this physical cliff is a self-inflicted cliff. The Congress did it to itself over the last debt ceiling discussion, and we'll talk about the debt ceiling as well today.
Yeah.
But this was a political crisis much more than it was a financial crisis of some sort. And we saw all of the warts of our current political system on display during these last 5 days or so of really moving toward trying to find some kind of solution to this problem. So I think one of my primary observations here is, while we can talk about the specifics of the cliff, I think what's more important to focus on is, one, the dysfunction that it reveals and the ongoing dysfunction, and secondly, to think about the language that was used to describe this particular crisis as a crisis, when in actuality it wasn't a crisis. Now the one coming up is probably going to be a crisis. But
The debt ceiling issue.
and the debt ceiling issue. But also I think to recognize that this is just symptomatic of really our inability to talk about in a rational way, to share the same facts and to speak about those facts as a nation in similar kinds of ways. And those are my concerns going forward with this particular fiasco we just went through.
Ron?
Well, let's at least review what did happen. And part of this, of course, was that the last time the debt ceiling was an issue, there was sort of a compromise, and so there was a committee put together, and that they came up with this option that if we didn't, get our fiscal house in order, then there were going to be these draconian cuts were going to automatically take place right across the board. And of course, it also meant that the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy would expire at that point. The payroll tax cut for American citizens would also go away. It did end up going away, by the way, in the deal that came out. And so there were, they put together this package, and it was supposed to put pressure on the Congress So it was all an artificially created pressure, as you say, and then so that's why people kept saying, well, there was a fiscal cliff. We're going to go over this cliff. If they don't come up to some kind of an agreement here, then we're going to have this sequestration, all these massive cuts are going to take place, and all these other, tax increases are going to occur, and it's going to cause a new recession. It's going to hurt the economy. So again, it was a lot of it was just theater, wasn't it? It was and media-driven theater at that. The media today, the 24/7 cable media, loves a sense of crisis and impending doom, and the fiscal cliff was just perfect for them to really sink their teeth into. Again, totally artificially created. If the Congress was a normally functioning body, it would have resolved all these issues last year, right? In a reasonable, rational way. But it didn't do that. It's unable to do that, and so we ended up with this particular thing.
Can I just mention two things? One, remember that the Congress in 2000, whenever it originally passed the Bush tax cuts, they were passed with this sunset provision in.
Yes, right.
So they actually created that a long time ago. And the reason they created it with a sunset provision is they knew that those tax cuts were not sustainable in terms of the overall debt and deficit. And then secondly, in terms of sequestration, because I think this will feed into our later discussion, is both Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security were not part of the automatic cuts. So when we start talking about what was put on the table, that's important to remember.
Yes, right. So we had this artificially created crisis, and in the end, there was some compromise that was reached. And a lot of progressives were unhappy that Obama, freshly reelected, right, with an increased majority in the Senate, picking up seats in the House, and clearly there were 1 million more votes for Democratic candidates in the House of Representatives as well, even though because the House is so rigged, it's gerrymandered to be Republican safe at this point. There were still many, many more Americans voted for Democratic candidates in the House. So they thought, well, the president's in a good position. The Democrats are in a good position. They can stand firm. And they did to some extent. I mean, there were no cuts to Social Security or Medicare in this. They did, the Bush tax cuts were allowed to expire, although they had wanted them to be $250,000 income. Instead, it's going to be for those over $400,000. So that's, there's a significant drop in the revenue that could be obtained by, moving that up from $250,000 to $400,000. The sequestration, the cuts have been simply postponed, right? They haven't taken them completely away. They've been sort of postponed for the moment until we get to the next cliff. And so that's essentially what we ended up with as the package here. I don't think people on the right were screaming because they didn't get any significant cuts. There is a tax increase on some of the wealthy. The unemployment benefits were extended. The one thing that did surprise me is that the payroll tax cut didn't get extended, which I thought that it would. So that means that a lot of middle-class people are going to see, a restoration of their taxes up to where it had been in the past. It's not necessarily a tax increase, but the tax decrease has been allowed to expire. So, but again, it just seems to me that the main point I'd like to make all about this is that what we're really, this is a phony debate, the fix the debt debate, right? And this is being driven by ideologues on the right, by corporate CEOs who've put together this fix the debt committee and came up with this agenda. And it's really a phony issue because the debt is not the major problem that we're facing right now. At the end of World War II, we had a much more massive debt ratio in this country. And we still, at that point, saw fit to invest in our people, right? The GI Bill and the Marshall Plan to help restore markets in Europe. And, we did a lot of things at that, even though the debt ratio was much greater at that point. And we're in the same fix right now. The problem is a weak economy. Our deficit problem is mostly driven by the recession of 2008. Throw in the massive military spending and the spending on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those tax cuts for the wealthy. That's what's creating the problem of the deficits and the national debt. And but the weak economy is the main problem. And to deal with that weak economy, you can't deal with a weak economy by cutting the deficit. And so that's where I think we need to sort of redirect the political discussion. How are we going to improve the economy? How are we going to help the American people get back to work? How are we going to generate consumer demand? How are we going to invest in our infrastructure and deal with other issues like climate change? Those should be the real issues, and yet we have this phony debate, this austerity politics takes over, and we're told that to fix the debt is the most important issue, and the only way to do that is to cut. And that's just disaster. That's economic disaster for our country if we do that. And economists like Paul Krugman and others have been pointing this out for a long, long time, but they don't seem to get through to the political class on this issue.
Plus, there's a model in Great Britain. They did the austerity route, and
look where it got them.
look
Right?
where it got them.
Yeah.
So, I do think there are, as it turned out, I agree with everything you're saying. It's a jobs deficit. It's not a financial deficit problem. However, I do think that had nothing been done and all those taxes had gone up, it probably would have resulted in a double-dip recession, because that would be a huge hit to middle-class folks and to our economy, to have that, again, that sudden increase in taxes overall. So that also would have, while it would have brought more revenue into our coffers, I think its actual consequences would have been pretty significant for this very slow recovery. It would have brought us back into double dip. But the debate itself is being framed incorrectly. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think there's two things about this that really strike me, and I think Ron has touched on both of them. One is the historical amnesia. The whole, no discussion about how we ended up where we are right now. The two wars, unfunded, the tax breaks for the wealthiest people in the country, the Wall Street collapse, which came because of the lack of regulations on the banks and Wall Street itself, and then a medical plan for seniors, which was unfunded. All of these things were decisions that were made by a Republican government that put us in this position that we have right now. And their solution is that people who had nothing to do with any of these things should pay the price for that. And they sell that to the American people. And if you don't look at the history, you could buy into that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that at bottom, what we're really looking at right now is an issue of what is the role of government. And I think it goes back to Reagan. Because I think since Reagan was president, the whole strategy was to drain the Treasury so that any kind of response of the government in terms of social programs would be unaffordable. And I think that's what they continue to do. And I think the question that's on the table is, does the government have a role in creating jobs? Does the government have a role in climate change? Do we have a role in dealing with poverty when we have about 46 million people living in poverty and 20 million of them living at half the poverty line? What's our role with education when we're falling further and further behind the rest of the world? Is this all about individualism and everybody's on their own? Or, as we did during the New Deal and after the Second World War, does government step in to put the supports that are there to help people and our country move forward? I think that's the deeper question that is obscured by this shadow game.
Well, and ironically, I think that in part was what the last election was about, right?
Yeah.
It really
right,
was about,
exactly.
Are we on our own? And it's long history in our, as a republic. We've discussed this tension between individualism and community, right? But in effect, in the last election, 51% of the country said, no, we need to have increased taxes. We need to have some help out here. We need to have our government work
Right.
for us, not work against us. But then you turn around and after this debt vote, the House of Representatives didn't act on the relief for
New
the
York.
Hurricane
Yeah.
Sandy folks in New York and New Jersey. It's like this, it's almost like being jerked back from what you thought was progress being made. And those people have been suffering now for a significant period of time.
More than 60 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you've got your finger on it, but it gets played out in these sometimes petty and minor ways, and sometimes over major legislation, but not really in a way, again, that's rational and looks toward what are the long-term consequences
Yeah.
of this,
Yeah.
how can we account for this, what really, and we should in part blame ourselves in that we may not have the time and attention to pay to the larger philosophical arguments. For us, it's about, I live in New Jersey and my house was just destroyed by a hurricane. I don't care whether you're focusing on individualism or community. Just give me some help. Let me build my house back again, you know?
And it was very interesting to see Governor Christie, Republican governor of New Jersey, just tear into
Right,
Boehner and
right.
and there are other Republicans in Congress for their failure to do this. And Representative King from New York, who's also Republican, just lambasted the rest of his party, saying nobody should give a dime to the Republican Party, in New York if they're not going to come through with this aid that had been promised. So you have some Republicans who are now criticizing. I think there's a struggle going on within the Republican Party itself. The party has moved so far to the right. The Republican Party today is so extremist. I mean, I don't think there's any precedent in American history for how ideologically extreme some segments of the Republican Party are. Since the Tea Party movement and the 2010 election, the Republican Party has moved so far to the right that it is just a complete outlier, and it's not open to any kind of rational fact-finding with regard to issues. It has a core set of ideological beliefs that government in any form is bad, is evil, and needs to be slashed, and that somehow this is going to result in some good things, despite all the evidence of all the horrible things that happen when you slash government to the bone as they're proposing. So there's that struggle that's going on, and I think we're really in for a very rough time coming up on the debt ceiling debate.
Yeah.
Unless there are some members of the Republican Party in the Congress who are willing to stand up to the most extremist elements of their own party. And so we're talking to you, Fred Upton. I mean, our local congressman, Fred Upton, has a history of being a moderate, of working with the Democratic Party, of seeking compromises, of being reasonable. Now, since Fred himself has been challenged by Jack Hogendijk, who more of a Tea Party type ideologue, Fred and Fred wanting to be chair of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, both those situations, Fred experienced a strong challenge from the right wing and accusations that he was Red Fred, that he was somehow a socialist or a liberal,
Right.
Which is ridiculous.
I think
right?
we're safe on that.
Right, yeah.
But we did see a very decided change in Fred's behavior and his voting patterns after that. He did move very sharply to the right. He has been a main obstacle with regard to climate change legislation in the House. And so Fred has moved much more to the right. Now, we need Fred to come back to where he used to be. We need Fred to come back to that centrist politician, that moderate, reasonable person who could work with the opposing party for the benefit of the people of his own district and the country. So we really need Fred Upton to return to his roots, right?
Absolutely.
And if we don't have, if the Fred Uptons of the world don't do this, then we're really in a lot of trouble. If the extremist elements of the Republican Party manage to obstruct on the debt ceiling, and we don't raise the debt ceiling, which I mean, let's point out that in the past, raising the debt ceiling was just an automatic issue.
Normal.
Right.
It's just, okay, this is just a bookkeeping thing that has to be done, right? And if we don't do it, we can't pay our bills, right? And of course, what country is going to default on their bills, and how would that affect their standing in the world economic community? And so it was an automatic thing under Reagan, under Bush, under Bush 2. It wasn't even a thought. I mean, no Republican would have thought to vote against raising the debt ceiling in the past. Not one Republican, I don't think, had ever even thought about voting against raising the debt ceiling. It was just an automatic thing that had to be done. If you were fiscally responsible, you would do this, right? And now, all of a sudden, the extremist elements of the Republican Party have seized upon this as a way to hold the country hostage. You know, we're going to, you know, they basically got the baby with the knife to the throat of the baby, saying, we're going to kill the baby unless you do it our way. I mean, that's an extreme image, but I think it's not an inaccurate.
Right.
They're holding us hostage,
Right.
and they're threatening to do great harm to our country unless we go their way and pay obeisance to their rigid ideology of slashing government to the bone, which means cutting Social Security, which means cutting Medicare, which means cutting Medicaid. That's what they're after. That's what they want to destroy. And, you know, Fred Upton and other Republicans who have been more moderate and reasonable in the past have to step up and say to the more extremist elements of their party, no, you can't do this. This is wrong. This is morally wrong for you to do this. This is not the way we function in this country.
I'm very glad you used the word moral, because I was feeling, you know, in talking about all this technology and thinking about, you know, what is really the function of government? Well,
Yeah.
I think it's to provide safety and security for its citizens. Not some of its citizens, but all of its citizens. And this tension that you were talking about, Don, Ron, the tension between the individual and the community, if you just look at the legislation that has occurred in the last 40 years, how much of it funnels resources either away and into, or directly into, that individual philosophy which says somehow if you've made it, you are a better person than those who don't make it. So if I'm going to be concerned in the ideology of the conservatives, if I'm going to be concerned, I'm going to be concerned with people who have made it, because they are, obviously they've made it and they're more moral, or they wouldn't have made it.
Right.
So that this is so erosive on the level of the value judgment that is reflected in the programs of the government.
Yeah.
How does one who's not getting those resources made available, what happens to the psychology of that person? And I think that you either turn outward or you turn inward. And at some point we'll probably be talking about violence, but that's I think what happens. People just find it intolerable to be nameless, faceless, to be the invisible quality in the society.
Yeah, I think that on that point, of the people that are turning inward, I mean, there's a tremendous number of people who have just given up, that they lose all confidence in themselves, they see no way out, and so they're just surviving, and they're just getting through. Yesterday, I went down to the unemployment office, not for myself, so far, but it was packed. I mean, you could hardly get in the place.
Really?
And there's people all over that place. And I spoke to the director, and I said, Fred, there's no jobs, are there? He says, there's jobs out here, but there's two things. One, people don't have the skills for those jobs. We're not giving people the supports that they need to get the skills for those jobs. Or secondly, the jobs that are available don't pay enough for them to live on. And I think that's really where we are. We're not giving people the support. And I know young people in their 20s, a lot of them in this community, who have lost such confidence in themselves that they don't want to apply for jobs anymore because they can't stand the rejection that comes from all the time. So you're right. If the supports aren't there, then either people turn inward and then collapse on themselves, or turn outward, which is what Occupy was about.
Well, and we had talked earlier about the crime rate with gun involvement, and certainly is another statistic that we'll be talking about, I think, later.
I think one of the things, speaking of being rational, one of the things that's totally irrational about this debt ceiling limit is that what people don't seem to understand, the Congress itself included, is that raising the debt ceiling limit is related to legislation that has already passed.
Mm-hmm.
So they've already said, we're going to spend this amount of money, right?
They've committed themselves.
They've
to do
committed
that.
themselves. So what raising the debt limit does, it allows the government to, in the short term, borrow money to be able to fund those very projects that the Congress has just passed. So if they really wanted to control spending, they could have controlled it there. And then they wouldn't have to raise the debt ceiling, right? So, for example, I think yesterday President Obama signed the defense spending bill, authorization bill, and I believe it was $650 billion, about $100 billion more than he asked for, than the Department of Defense asked for. So where do you think that $100 billion went? Right?
Yeah.
Where did it go? Well, it went to Senator so-and-so's state, and Congressman so-and-so's district, and Congresswoman so-and-so district. So if we're really serious, there are multiple ways that both spending cuts could be made in defense, not the least of which Joe Scarborough, probably from the reddest state possible, and a firebrand of conservatives, says, why aren't we shutting down military bases around the world? Why are we expending our dollars to defend, he said this morning, to defend Western Europe from Stalin? Right? It doesn't make sense anymore. So there are multiple things that could be done. The other thing I think that earlier when we were talking about it being a job crisis, it's also a healthcare crisis.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is really the primary driver of what is costing people personally, and ultimately what is affecting us at the state level and the federal level. I think our spending on healthcare in the United States is something like 18% of our gross domestic product.
It's about that, yeah.
Something like that, and we're higher than
almost twice
as much
as
every other developed country.
Right, yeah.
That's a problem.
It's huge. 60% of the bankruptcies in the country are caused by health care.
Right.
And we know that there's other models out there.
Exactly.
We know that there's other countries that have found ways to do this at about half the price and keep their people healthier. I totally agree. That is the biggest problem, I think, with the militarism and the healthcare thing. If we could tame those two things. Everybody agrees that if we went to a single-payer system, we would save about 15% of our healthcare costs, which is over $1 trillion right now, just on administrative costs.
Correct.
But that's not being done because it's not in the interest of the people that are making a lot of money off where we are now.
Exactly.
The drug companies, the insurance companies, the private hospital complexes.
That's right.
I mean, these are corporate interests that are benefiting enormously from this broken healthcare system that we have. That's driving up the costs far higher than, as you point out, far higher than any other comparable countries. And that's as you say, the broken healthcare system, that's the greatest source of deficits in the future. If we really wanted to deal with the deficit debt issue, that's where we have to go. Cutting, Social Security contributes nothing to the debt.
No.
Why do they keep talking about cutting Social Security, raising the retirement age, cutting benefits? Social Security has absolutely nothing to do with the current debt or deficit. Nothing, because it's a trust fund. People pay in separately to it. People get paid benefits out according to the levels Congress sets out of that. It doesn't contribute to it's not involved with the discretionary congressional decisions about spending. And yet that's what they're targeting. That's what they want to go after. And yet they're ignoring all the other things that they could do to bring down health care costs just negotiating drug
Oh,
prices.
there you go.
Right.
Right there.
One simple thing. Every other
Right.
country in the world, drives a hard bargain, negotiates, but no, we can't do that. We're prohibited from doing that, which means drug company profits remain extremely high, and again, our deficit continues to grow.
Right. We pay twice as much annually for drugs as any other developed country in the world does. I think what's interesting about Social Security is there. I think that its current kind of shelf life, so to speak, is like in 2030 or something like that, somewhere out there in the 30s of this time frame. But it wouldn't take very much to add
Extend it.
and
would be
extend
fine.
it.
Yeah.
All you'd have to do is raise
The
income ceiling.
Yeah.
It's a very simple fix.
Exactly.
It's $113,700 right now.
Yeah.
Why should people stop paying into Social Security once they make $113,000?
Yeah.
It makes no sense. It's a remnant of debates that FDR and
Yeah.
shenanigans FDR had to go through to get Social Security passed in the first place.
Exactly.
It's a remnant of that, but it makes no fiscal sense right now.
Right.
And again, why should people stop paying into Social Security once they get to that level of income?
Right.
And again, it's a very simple solution. Social Security could be taken care of forever if we simply raise the income ceiling.
Right, and capital gains, you don't pay anything on capital gains.
Right.
So, yeah, right. So,
I think the other thing I want to talk about in reference to Social Security and Medicare, I think one of the challenges is calling them entitlements.
Oh, boy.
yeah.
That term, it has kind of a bad taste for most people. Like, well, you think you're entitled.
Yeah.
The reality is that term actually means you are entitled to it because you paid into it.
Right.
So that connection between entitlement as somehow privileged
Yeah.
versus entitlement as I worked for it, I put money into it, I
Right.
earned it, is those are two different definitions of what entitlement means. And unfortunately, the one about, somehow not working for it,
Right, right.
or not earning it in some way has taken precedence. The other thing I'm very concerned about with both Social Security and Medicare is there are conversations around means testing,
Oh, yeah.
around, primarily means testing. What begins to happen when not everyone in the country is participating is it becomes easier and easier to
Right.
totally eliminate
Exactly.
a program. If we really are a community, everybody contributes and everybody gets to
Right.
receive from the system.
And I guess the best illustration of that is what happens, the difference between Social Security, which is indexed, and temporary assistance to needy families, which is not indexed. So as Social Security goes up and temporary assistance, because this is not universal and this is universal. And
Exactly.
that's exactly what would happen. Yeah.
And I think the third thing is an acknowledgement by everyone in the country that we all benefit from these programs.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a real misunderstanding of Medicaid. Medicaid benefits many middle-class families. How does it benefit? You get to keep grandma in a nursing home.
Yes. Yes.
The vast majority of the funds actually go to senior citizens. And what about disabled children and disabled
Right.
adults? They need to be able to receive the support that's available through Medicaid.
Yes.
So it isn't for the poor, which is that sort of makers and takers mentality.
Right.
It really does benefit many, many, many families in this
Absolutely.
country.
Absolutely.
So until people are willing to acknowledge that they are receiving benefits from these programs and therefore have a stake in them, it's always the other person
Right.
who somehow is getting something
Yeah.
that is undeserved.
I think part of that, what makes me uncomfortable, not with what you said, but with the issue that you're raising, for me, it goes back to the media. That when you've got some issue that you're trying to illustrate the ways in which people can benefit, rather than talking in factual terms, you get the kind of thing we've been talking about here, these metaphors, like
That's right.
the cliff, which obscures the factual content of the program. And then you get pundits who stir the pot up even more and confuse people with the issues. It seems to me that what we also need is a greater clarification of these consequences that come from when that misdirection or misinformation occurs for people who really need it. Second thing is, if we could only get rid of the idea that some people, when you were talking about the entitlement and the means testing, I used to think to myself, drop the S, and what you've got is mean testing, because what it does to people is mean.
Yes.
And what kind
Right.
of minds are operating to create an atmosphere in which it's appropriate to treat some people meanly and others with preference? It just, again, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And that's what austerity politics are all about, treating the middle class and people below that as meanly as possible in order to save money for corporations and the wealthy. That's what it really comes down to. That's what it boils down to in the starkest possible terms. In order to allow the wealthy to gain even more wealth and corporations to gain even more in terms of profits, we're going to impose austerity politics and make everybody else in the country's lives worse,
Right.
Right.
meaner.
Right.
And that's the stark reality that we have to face. Now, it gets dressed up, of course, in all this different kind of language. This is the George Lakoff
Right.
idea
Right.
about the political framing. And, of course, the right has been very, very good, very effective at framing these things politically in a way that supports their position. And that's one of the things Lakoff's always arguing, you know, progressives, those on the left, have to fight back against that. And, you know, not in a deceptive way, but we have to politically frame things in a more appropriate way to reveal what's really the underlying issue there.
Yeah, I just think that the way it's dressed up covers the real issues that are here. And I guess the fundamental issue for me is, what kind of a country do we want to be? I mean, how has all this paid off for the common good? We're falling behind every other country. We're way behind what we were before. And yet they continue to sell this plan that we have to take care of the corporations and the people at the top for the common good. It doesn't do anything for the common good. The common good is more and more diminished each year we follow these kind of policies.
Well, and so far there's been very little done in reference to the banks, who,
jeez.
you know, ended up making out like bankets.
Yeah.
Banksters.
Banksters, I guess, after the TARP, and they're screaming about what's happening to their situation. You know, it just seems like there is no there's no ground on which they are willing to give. Now, I don't want to paint everybody with a broad brush. There are, of course, people who are who do care
Absolutely.
about what happens
Absolutely.
to the country, and who do support. Many people came out, many very wealthy people came out and said, you know, go ahead, tax me more. You know,
Yeah.
I have a good life and I can pay more. So we don't want to paint with a completely broad brush, but in general, we've been having the dominance of corporations. Just look at the amount of corporate welfare there is, whether it's at the local level or at the state level or beyond.
Yeah.
Robert Borosage in a column the other day said, let's focus on the predators, not the prey.
Yeah.
That's a good
That's
one.
what we're talking about here. Let's
Yeah.
look at the predators. And Jamie Galbraith's book on the predator state from a couple years ago. I mean, you know, that's the irony here, I think, is that the far right argues that we need to slash government and government is bad and government is evil. And yet what's really, really happening is that the wealthy and the corporations use the government to enrich themselves in a variety of ways. The military-industrial complex, that defense, that Pentagon budget that went up billions of dollars, you know, the corporate welfare that you're talking about, the drug companies benefiting from our lack of ability to bargain with them, on drug prices. So it really is a predator state. They're not getting rid of the state. They're not reducing government. They're simply using government as a vehicle to further enrich themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
It is a class warfare. I mean, let's be honest. It's a class warfare that's going on. To point that out, you're called a, you say, oh, you're engaging in class warfare. We're simply pointing out the obvious, that there is a class war already going on, and they're the ones that are waging it, right?
Exactly. And let me tell you how that's playing, one way that's playing out at the local level here in this city. I just looked at some statistics yesterday. 10 years ago, we had 892 city workers. This year, we'll have 640. We're down 250 city workers. We're going to be down 24 policemen next year because we don't have the money to pay for them. So what's happening is the resources that this country has are sticking at the top, and ordinary people are having to pay the price.
Yeah. We're not broke.
Right. $15 trillion annual economy.
We're not broke. We're not a poor country.
Right.
It's a matter of the way in which the economy is skewed, and the inequality, structural inequality, has been created in this country.
Yeah.
And so we end up starving our public sector to the great detriment of people who need those critical city services, and who need these family security programs like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And we're again, this is austerity politics. We're mean to the middle class and anybody below the middle class in order to continue to enrich the 1%, those at the top.
Yeah. We have about 12 minutes left, and I wanted to return to my meanness thing. It seems to me that in this process of meanness, there's also some segregation that goes on between genders. Women seem to be being attacked by government policy rather than supported by the government policy. And I'm wondering if others of you, for instance, in Michigan, now you've got the new legislation. I don't think it's clear exactly how it's going to work out, in which the standards for women's health care clinics have been escalated, so that it makes it harder for the organizations to provide services, all kinds of services for women. So I'm just wondering if others of you feel that same sense of the segregating and the meanness and the hostility that it seems to represent.
Well, I guess this is a good segue, using Social Security as an example. For women, Social Security is an incredibly vital support in their old age. First of all, women live longer, but secondly, if you think about many women, they've not had that kind of opportunity to build up, for whatever reason, a career where they've had the kind of investments into 401ks or some kind of retirement account, and they are totally reliant on Social Security as their income on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
And then that also relates to Medicare for women who, again, typically live longer and are solely reliant on that for their health care needs. Now, in addition, we see on a pretty consistent basis misunderstanding of the results of the last election, where women essentially supported President Obama and the Democratic Party to a large degree, particularly single women, and said, look, we are not going to take this anymore. Unfortunately, we see that that message didn't go very far. So our own governor has signed into law a series of quite restrictive laws that will limit women's access to health care and will limit women's access to abortion services. And I want to point out that the majority of abortions that occur in this country occur in married women. They occur because of the very things you're talking about, financial reasons. We cannot afford to have another child at this time. So it isn't, the 16-year-old who's gotten pregnant, although there are clearly those patients who go to those clinics, but the vast majority of pregnancy terminations in this country are for married women, whether it's a health reason, a financial reason, whatever. So it really is an ongoing battle that is now devolved from the federal level to the state level, where abortion restrictions are increasingly being passed, in part because there are many states that are Republican legislature and Republican governor. The other thing that I'm really distressed about is that the Violence Against Women Act has not passed the Congress. It was passed by the Senate, and it's been held up in the House for months and months now. And because the Congress expired yesterday, I guess it was, or the day before, now the Violence Against Women Act has to go through the Senate again, and it will have to go through the House again, if it can even get to the floor. Remember that when we started talking today, we talked a little bit about the dysfunctional structure of the Congress. And one of the rules that the House has is that the majority of the majority has to agree to bring a bill to the floor. So the Republicans have the majority in the House, and the majority of the majority has to agree. Now, for this past bill that passed with the debt, with the taxes and the fiscal cliff, they did violate that rule. So perhaps going forward they may violate it again, but Boehner's under a lot of pressure. But the Violence Against Women Act has been around, and just like the debt ceiling thing, has been kind of an automatic, yes, we all agree that these services should be available to women across the country. They support domestic violence shelters, they help support rape crisis centers, all kinds of outreach to women who find themselves in difficult situations, and they've not brought it to the floor. Their argument is the benefits have been expanded, and they're correct. They've been expanded to immigrant women, they've been expanded to same-sex partners, and to tribal populations. They're using the tribal population as the excuse because tribal lands have their own kind of governing structure. But I'm guessing it's probably more about the same-sex partners and the immigrant non-citizen services. So, once again, they're demonstrating their disregard for women and women's health.
The Republican war on women, as it was termed during the last election, is not just a catchy political phrase. I mean, there's there's strong evidence that there's substance to this. I mean, just need to look at what they're doing or not doing, and in a sense, what they're doing or not doing, depending on the particular issue, directly harms women.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, so talk about a war on women, it is directly harming women.
And this is another area where we might ask Fred Upton what he's going to do.
Yes.
What he's going to do about making sure that the women in Southwest Michigan are protected.
This seems to have been part of the program of the American Legislative, ALET, A-L-E-T, economic, that they've had a hand in this, as they've had a hand in the gun issues. They're apparently loaded with lots of money and moving forward rather than a cessation on their part to get the legislation that they want.
They're moving forward on moving us backward.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the American Legislative Exchange Council, I believe it's. Basically, this is a corporate-funded right-wing think tank that creates model legislation for example, the legislation on the so-called right-to-work law in Michigan was written by Alex.
Right.
You know, our Republicans in our legislature couldn't even be innovative and creative on their own and come up with their own right-to-work law. They just borrowed whatever Alex had already written for them. And increasingly, this is what's happening. And it's another sign of the dysfunction of our democracy.
Right.
Right. You mentioned the guns, the violence and the guns. I think we ought to talk a little bit about that, especially in the light of what happened in Connecticut and other aspects of the guns. And I know, Ron, you've been looking at that.
Yeah, I don't know if we have enough time on this particular program to really get into that issue. We're running a little bit short of time. But yeah, I think Alex has certainly been involved in conjunction with the NRA in helping to block any kind of sensible legislation relating to gun control. That's one of the issues that's going to certainly come up after what happened in Newtown. More pressure has been building at least let's have some semblance of gun laws. Let's try to at least do something about these high-tech weapons where you can fire multiple times in rapid fashion with large capacity magazines and kill as many people as possible. I don't think many of the members of the NRA who are hunters or target shooters feel that they need to have those kinds of weapons in order to partake in their particular passions. And again, just the whole issue concerning background checks, especially for the private dealers and the gun shows. I mean, there are some things that we can do. And again, that's not a panacea. You know, we have so many guns already floating around in this country that you know, we're sort of, you know, to use the old cliche, we're locking the barn door after the horse has already escaped on that issue. But there are some things that we could certainly do. The so-called assault weapons ban, I think, needs to come back. Dianne Feinstein in the Senate is going to reintroduce that. Again, some of the licensing requirements, background checks, we need to make sure that as much as we can, and this is an extremely difficult thing to do, to make sure that those high-tech weapons don't fall into the hands of people who have some kind of mental instability. But I mean, let's take the Newtown shooting. The shooter, the guns were legal. They were purchased by his mother. You know, no background check would have prevented him from getting access to those guns and doing what he did, the horrific thing that he did. So, so I think gun control is back on the agenda, but I think we need to make progress there. We can do some things on gun control, but we have to understand that that's not enough. That many other things have to be done. We have to address some of the larger structural and cultural issues that are related to gun violence in this country, and we're certainly, that's not a part of the discussion, and it needs to be a part of the discussion. And again, the way in which, you know, we've been talking a lot about structural inequality today. We talked about it with regard to social class. We talked about it with regard to gender. We also need to talk about it with regard to race. And this is where the gun issue really comes into play. Now, what happened in Newtown is extremely tragic, one of the most horrific things. I think we all shed tears over what happened there. But the reality is that there are kids getting killed every single day in urban centers of this country.
Right.
500 in Chicago, 350 in Philadelphia, 390 in Detroit. Most of these are African American young males. Overwhelmingly, guns are involved in almost all these. So these are some of the other broader issues that I think we need to address, and maybe we can devote another program and come back and revisit that issue and really get into some of those issues.
Yeah, and the other thing that I would want to add would be accessibility to mental health services, because in the early 1970s, when we did deinstitutionalization of the hospitals, the mental health hospitals, which was a good idea, the contract was that we would put the supports in the community, but those supports never came. And there's just not enough supports out there for people that are mentally ill. And you're right, gun control is the first thing, but there's these other things. The mental health issue and the poverty issue. I remember that one article from the New York Times where the guy said, I want to take a line from the NRA. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. He says, what I want to say is guns don't kill people, poverty kills people. Because it's in the inner city where the overwhelming amount of that violence has taken place.
And we should point out that overall, crime is down in the United States. It has fallen since the mid-90s. Violence is down in the United States, despite these horrific things that have happened recently. Overall violence is down, violence against children is down, but school violence is down. But it's still far, far, far too high, right? So we've come down off of an extreme high, but we're still an outlier. We're still exceptional. I mean, the problem with crime in the United States is lethal violence. And we stand out from every other Western industrial democracy in the world with the amount of violent crime that we have and the homicide rates that we have. And this is an issue that we really need to address. And we've made some progress, but there's so much more that needs to be done.
And they're clearly following the shootings. A couple of different blog posts, bloggers just did sort of like every day added, unfortunately, bodies, but added bodies to how many people were killed that day by gun violence, and then added more and added more. And when you see it actually laid out on a day-to-day basis of how many people in the United States die from gun violence, it's pretty shocking. And some of those are suicides. We forget about having a gun in the home.
Most are suicides.
Increases the likelihood that someone who has suicidal tendencies will actually lethally carry it through, right? So something has to be done about this problem.
Which is probably related to the high rate of suicide amongst veterans returning, where they either have kept a weapon or have availability to a weapon. Okay, it looks like we're getting our signal. Leigh, it's been just great having you back, and Don and Ron. It's a wonderful discussion today. Makes me very pleased to be part of this effort to get this kind of information out to those who watch us. I'm still seeing people in the grocery store who say, I saw you on TV, and I'm sure you two have also. So thank you for staying with us for the hour. We will return again with a new program in a couple of weeks. And again, thank you to all of you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn.